I stand now in a quiet place, a place where marble columns once rose toward an impossibly blue sky, where footsteps echoed on stone worn smooth by countless sandaled feet, and where voices, urgent, questioning, endlessly curious, filled the air with ideas that would ripple forward through millennia. The light here is golden and slanting, the kind of light that comes in late afternoon when the sun hangs low over distant hills, casting everything in amber and honey, softening the edges of the world until even the hardest stone seems to glow from within. I can almost see them, these figures in simple robes, walking beneath colonnades, sitting in the shade of olive trees, their hands moving as they speak, gesturing toward the heavens, or tracing invisible diagrams in the dust at their feet. Men who devoted their lives not to conquest or commerce, but to something far more elusive, the pursuit of a wisdom, the examination of existence itself. This is ancient Greece, a world of city-states perched on rocky peninsulas, of harbors filled with trading vessels, of amphitheaters carved into hillsides, and of agoras, those bustling public squares where citizens gathered to debate and discuss, to buy and sell, to argue and learn, but more than any marketplace or monument, more than any temple or theater. What defined this world was the presence of philosophers, thinkers who looked at the same sun and sea and stars that everyone else saw, and asked different questions, not how to navigate by the stars, but what the stars were made of, not how to appease the gods, but whether the gods existed at all, not how to live a successful life, but what success truly meant, what goodness was, what justice required, what reality itself consisted of. These questions seem almost unbearably large, the kind of inquiries that could consume a lifetime. And, indeed, they did, generation after generation of brilliant minds returning to the same fundamental puzzles, refining them, expanding them, building elaborate systems of thought that still echo in every philosophy classroom, every ethics debate, every moment when someone pauses and wonders about the nature of truth. I imagine the air itself in those days, dry and warm, carrying the scent of thyme and rosemary from the hillsides, the salt tang of the Aegean, the smell of olive oil and wine and bread, and underneath it all, the particular atmosphere of concentrated thought, of minds engaged in the most demanding work humans can undertake, the work of thinking clearly, of questioning assumptions, of following logic wherever it might lead. The philosophers walked these streets and paths, some wealthy and well-connected, others poor and peculiar, some surrounded by eager students, others wandering alone, but all united by this strange compulsion to understand, to examine, to question everything that others simply accepted. They gathered in gymnasiums and gardens, in porticos and private homes, wherever there was space to sit and talk, to think aloud, to test ideas against the sharp edges of dialectic, that method of question and answer, of proposal and counter-proposal, of slowly building toward truth through conversation. I can almost hear the rhythm of those dialogues, the back and forth, the moment when someone raises an objection, the pause as the other considers, the new formulation that emerges, slightly different, more precise, closer to something essential. This world of ancient Greek philosophy spans centuries, from the earliest pre-Socratic thinkers who looked at the natural world and wondered about its fundamental substance, through the golden age of classical Athens, and forward into the Hellenistic period when Greek thought spread across the Mediterranean and beyond. influencing every culture it touched. And throughout all those years, through all those different schools and systems and approaches, there runs a common thread, the belief that human reason could penetrate the mysteries of existence, that careful thought and honest inquiry could lead to genuine understanding, that wisdom was attainable if one was willing to dedicate oneself entirely to its pursuit. So I begin, as I see here, in this luminous space between history and imagination, ready to walk among these ancient thinkers, to visit their schools and their debates, to trace the evolution of their ideas, to see how questions asked more than 2,000 years ago continue to shape the way we think about everything that matters. The columns stand in rows, their shadows lengthening across marble and stone, and somewhere in the distance, the murmur of voices engaged in eternal conversation. The story begins on the edges, in the coastal cities of Ionia, where Greek-speaking colonists had established prosperous settlements along what is now the western coast of Turkey. Places like Miletus and Ephesus, cities that looked outward toward the sea, toward trade routes and foreign ideas, toward Egypt and Babylon and Persia. It was here, in the 6th century before the Common Era, that something remarkable began to happen, a new way of thinking about the world, one that would break away from purely mythological explanations and seek instead natural causes, rational principles, underlying patterns that could be discovered through observation and thought. The earliest of these thinkers is Thales of Miletus, a man who lived around 600 years before the Common Era, a merchant and mathematician who traveled widely, who predicted a solar eclipse, who measured the height of pyramids by their shadows, and who asked a question that seems simple but was revolutionary: what is everything made of? Before Thales, the answer would have involved gods and creation myths, stories of divine beings shaping the world from chaos. But Thales proposed something different. He suggested that all things, despite their apparent diversity, arose from a single substance, and he believed that substance was water. Water, which flows and freezes and evaporates, which takes countless forms, which is essential to all living things, which covers most of the earth. Perhaps water was the fundamental reality, and everything else merely transformations of this one primal element. We might smile at this conclusion now, but the question itself was extraordinary. The idea that beneath the multiplicity of appearances there might be a unity, a single principle from which everything derived. This was the beginning of philosophy, the attempt to find rational explanations for the nature of reality. Thales had students and successors, other thinkers in Miletus who took up his project but proposed different answers. Anaximander, who lived just after Thales, suggested that the fundamental substance was not water, but something he called the apeiron, the boundless or indefinite, something infinite and undefined from which all determinate things emerged. Anaximander created one of the first models of the cosmos, imagining the earth as a cylinder floating in space, surrounded by wheels of fire, glimpsed through openings that appeared as sun and moon and stars. He thought about how life might have originated, suggesting that humans must have descended from fish, an astonishing intuition of evolutionary thinking thousands of years before Darwin. Then came Anaximenes, the third great Milesian thinker, who proposed that air was the fundamental substance, air which could be rarefied into fire or condensed into wind and cloud and water and finally earth, a theory that tried to explain how the one could become the many through processes of expansion and compression. These Milesian philosophers, these first hesitant steps toward rational inquiry, were attempting something humans had never quite done before. They were trying to understand the world without appealing to divine intervention, to find natural explanations, to discover principles that operated consistently and could be understood through reason. And while they disagreed about the answers, the very fact that they were asking these questions, that they were proposing theories and debating them, created a new intellectual culture, one where ideas were tested against observation and logic rather than simply accepted on authority. Further south, on the island of Samos, and later in the Greek colonies of southern Italy, another kind of inquiry was developing. Here Pythagoras founded not just a school of thought, but something like a religious community, a brotherhood dedicated to the study of mathematics and music, bound by strict rules and secret teachings. Pythagoras, who may have lived from around 570 to 490 before the Common Era, believed that number was the fundamental reality, that mathematical relationships governed everything from the movements of celestial bodies to the harmonies of musical strings, that the cosmos itself was ordered according to numerical principles. The Pythagoreans discovered the mathematical ratios that produce harmonious musical intervals. They explored the properties of triangles and developed geometric proofs. They believed in the transmigration of souls, in reincarnation, and they lived according to various prohibitions and practices that seem mysterious to us now, avoiding beans, maintaining periods of silence, studying the properties of sacred shapes. For them, mathematics was not merely a tool, but a window into ultimate truth. Numbers revealed the hidden structure of reality, and through understanding numerical relationships, one could achieve not just knowledge, but purification, a spiritual ascent. Pythagoras left no writings, and much of what we know about him is entangled with legend, but his influence spread through southern Italy and Sicily, creating a tradition of mathematical mysticism that would profoundly shape later philosophy, especially Plato's belief in eternal forms and mathematical ideals. Meanwhile, in Ephesus, a city known for its great temple to Artemis, there lived a philosopher of an entirely different temperament, Heraclitus, who wrote in paradoxes and riddles, who was known as the Obscure One, the dark philosopher, because his sayings were so cryptic and challenging. Heraclitus, who flourished around 500 before the Common Era, saw reality as fundamentally characterized by change and conflict. Everything flows, he said. You cannot step twice into the same river, for fresh waters are ever flowing in upon you. The universe for Heraclitus was not static but dynamic, composed of opposites in tension, hot and cold, wet and dry, life and death, and it was precisely this tension, this strife between opposites, that generated everything. War is the father of all things, he proclaimed, not celebrating violence, but recognizing that existence itself arose from opposition and change. Yet beneath all of this flux, Heraclitus believed there was a logos, a rational principle, a kind of cosmic reason that governed the patterns of change, the way fire transforms wood into smoke and ash, the way day gives way to night and night to day. These transformations followed a hidden harmony, an order that most people failed to perceive. Fire was Heraclitus' symbol for this ever-living process. Fire that consumes and transforms, that is never the same from moment to moment, yet maintains its character as fire, an image of unity in multiplicity, permanence in change. His philosophy was challenging, even disturbing, because it denied the solidity of things. It suggested that what we take to be stable and enduring is actually in constant flux. That identity itself is a kind of illusion, or at least something far more complex than it appears. In stark contrast, in the Greek colonies of southern Italy, Parmenides of Elea proposed a philosophy that denied change entirely. He argued through a long and difficult poem that true being must be eternal, unchanging, indivisible, complete. Parmenides, who lived in the early 5th century before the Common Era, used rigorous logical argument to demonstrate that change and multiplicity were impossible, that they violated the basic principles of thought. Whatever is, and whatever is not, and there is no middle ground, no becoming, no coming to be or passing away. The world of change and diversity that we perceive through our senses, according to Parmenides, is an illusion, the way of seeming rather than the way of truth. Reality is one eternal, unchanging, and any philosophy that took change seriously was fundamentally mistaken. This was an audacious claim, and it created a profound problem for all subsequent philosophy. How could one account for the evident fact of change while respecting Parmenides' logical arguments? How could multiplicity be real if being was truly one? Parmenides had a brilliant student named Zeno, who defended his teacher's philosophy by developing a series of paradoxes designed to show that motion and change led to logical contradictions. The famous paradox of Achilles and the tortoise, the paradox of the arrow. Arguments so clever and troubling that philosophers would grapple with them for centuries. These early thinkers, scattered across the Greek world from Ionia to Italy, were creating the fundamental questions and problems that would occupy philosophy for its entire history. What is reality made of? Is it one or many? Does it change or remain eternally the same? Can we trust our senses or only our reason? What is the relationship between appearance and reality? And then, in the mid-5th century before the Common Era, the focus shifted. Athens, which had emerged as the greatest power in Greece after the Persian Wars, became the center of intellectual life. Drawing thinkers from across the Greek world into this vibrant city came the Sophists, professional teachers who traveled from city to city, offering instruction in rhetoric, persuasion, the arts of successful public speaking, essential skills in a democracy where political life depended on one's ability to argue effectively in the assembly and the courts. The Sophists were controversial figures. Some of them, like Protagoras, were serious intellectuals who thought deeply about ethics and epistemology. Protagoras declared that man is the measure of all things, suggesting a kind of relativism, that truth and value were human constructs, dependent on individual or cultural perspective. Others, like Gorgias, dazzled audiences with displays of rhetorical virtuosity, arguing brilliantly on any side of any question, demonstrating that persuasion was an art independent of truth. That language could be used to make the weaker argument appear stronger. This emphasis on rhetoric and persuasion, on winning arguments rather than discovering truth, troubled many Athenians. It seemed to undermine traditional values, to suggest that justice and virtue were merely matters of convention, that there was no objective right and wrong, only clever manipulation of opinion. And it was against this backdrop, in response to both the natural philosophers who studied the cosmos and the sophists who studied human affairs, that the most famous period of Greek philosophy would emerge, centered on three extraordinary figures, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, who would transform philosophy from scattered inquiry into systematic discipline. But before we reach them, we must linger here a moment longer in this earlier world of bold speculation and radical questioning, where philosophy was still young, still finding its methods, still discovering what questions mattered most. The sun continues its arc across that ancient sky. The shadows lengthen and shift, and the conversations continue. Voices rising and falling, questions multiplying, the great adventure of human thought gathering momentum. The streets of Athens in the late 5th century before the Common Era were narrow and winding, crowded with merchants and craftsmen, with citizens arguing politics and foreigners seeking fortune, the air thick with dust and noise and the particular energy of a city at the height of its power. And somewhere in that bustle, moving through the agora, stopping to talk with anyone who would engage him, was a peculiar figure, barefoot and snub-nosed, with a pot-belly and a face like a satyr, a man who claimed to know nothing, who spent his days asking questions, who would become the most influential philosopher who ever lived, despite never writing a single word. Socrates, born around 470 before the Common Era, was the son of a stonemason and a midwife, and he would describe his own method as a kind of midwifery, helping others give birth to ideas that were already within them. Drawing out knowledge through careful questioning, he would approach someone in the marketplace, often someone with a reputation for wisdom or expertise, and ask them to define some concept they claimed to understand. What is courage? What is justice? What is piety? What is knowledge itself? And the person would offer a definition, confident at first, but Socrates would probe gently, asking for clarification, proposing counterexamples, showing contradictions, and gradually the definition would unravel, revealing that what seemed clear and certain was actually confused and uncertain. This became known as the Socratic method, this relentless questioning, this refusal to accept easy answers, and it made Socrates both beloved and hated, beloved by young men who followed him around the city, delighted to watch him deflate the pretensions of their elders, hated by those same elders who found themselves publicly humiliated, exposed as not knowing what they claimed to know. But Socrates insisted he was performing a service. The unexamined life is not worth living, he proclaimed, and most people lived unexamined lives, accepting conventional beliefs without question, confusing opinion with knowledge, never bothering to think carefully about the most important matters, how to live, what to value, what it meant to be good. He had a divine mission, he said, given to him by the oracle at Delphi. The priestess there had declared that no one was wiser than Socrates, and he had set out to prove the oracle wrong, searching for someone genuinely wise, only to discover that while others thought they knew things they did not know, he at least knew that he knew nothing, and this awareness of his own ignorance was a kind of wisdom. Socrates fought in the Peloponnesian War, the long, devastating conflict between Athens and Sparta, he served with distinction as a hoplite soldier, showing physical courage, but his greater courage was intellectual and moral. His willingness to follow argument wherever it led, to stand up to political pressure, to remain true to his principles even when it cost him everything. He believed that virtue was knowledge, that no one did wrong willingly, that if you truly understood what was good, you would inevitably do it. This seemed paradoxical, but Socrates argued that when people acted badly, it was always because they were confused, mistaking what merely seemed good for what truly was good, chasing pleasure or wealth or power while losing sight of the genuine well-being of their souls. The soul, psyche in Greek, was Socrates' great concern, and not the body with its appetites and vulnerabilities, but the inner self, the rational and moral core of a person. And caring for the soul meant pursuing wisdom and virtue, meant examining oneself constantly, meant valuing truth over reputation, justice over success. His conversations often ended in aporia, a state of puzzlement, with no clear answer reached, but this was not failure, it was progress. Better to recognize one's ignorance than to remain trapped in false certainty. Better to keep questioning than to accept comfortable delusions. For decades, Socrates wandered Athens asking his questions, never charging fees like the sophists, living in poverty, wearing the same worn cloak year-round, subsisting on simple food, his needs minimal, because his focus was entirely on the life of the mind, on philosophy as a way of being rather than merely a subject to study. But Athens was changing. The long war with Sparta had ended in humiliating defeat. Democracy had been briefly overthrown by oligarchy, then restored. The city was traumatized and angry, looking for someone to blame. And Socrates, with his constant questioning, his association with men who had betrayed Athens, his habit of making prominent citizens look foolish, became a target. In 399 before the Common Era, when Socrates was 70 years old, he was brought to trial, charged with impiety, with failing to recognize the gods of the city and introducing new divinities, and with corrupting the youth, teaching them to question authority and tradition. The trial took place before a jury of 500 Athenian citizens, and Socrates defended himself, not by appealing to pity or making compromises, but by reaffirming everything he had always stood for. He would not stop philosophizing. He would not abandon his divine mission. He would rather die than live without examining life and pursuing truth. The jury found him guilty by a narrow margin, and according to Athenian law, both prosecution and defense could propose a penalty. The prosecution proposed death, and Socrates, in what might have been irony or genuine conviction, suggested that instead of punishment, he deserved to be maintained at public expense in the Prytaneum, the honor given to Olympic victors, because he had spent his life benefiting the city through philosophy. The jury was not amused and voted for death by an even larger margin. Socrates would drink hemlock, a poison that would gradually paralyze his body until it stopped his breathing and his heart. He spent his final days in prison, surrounded by friends and students, continuing to do what he had always done, talking about philosophy, examining questions about death and immortality and the nature of the soul, remaining cheerful and unafraid, insisting that a good person cannot be harmed, that nothing bad can happen to someone who has lived virtuously. On the day of his execution, He bathed and said farewell to his family, then drank the hemlock calmly, walking around until his legs grew heavy, then lying down as the numbness spread upward through his body. His final words were to remind his friend Crito that they owed a rooster to Asclepius, the god of healing, perhaps suggesting that death was a cure, a release of the soul from the body. And with Socrates' death, philosophy became something more than scattered inquiry. It became a way of life demanding total commitment, a calling that might require the ultimate sacrifice, and it inspired one of his devoted followers to ensure that Socrates' voice would never be silenced. That follower was Plato, born into an aristocratic Athenian family around 427 before the Common Era, a young man who might have pursued politics or poetry, but who encountered Socrates and devoted his life to philosophy instead. Plato was devastated by his teacher's execution. He left Athens for a time, traveling to Italy and Sicily, studying with the Pythagoreans, learning mathematics and geometry, absorbing their belief that abstract mathematical forms represented a higher reality than the physical world of flux and change. When he returned to Athens, around 387 before the Common Era, Plato founded a school in a grove sacred to the hero Academus, the Academy, which would continue for nearly 900 years, becoming the model for all later universities, a place dedicated entirely to the pursuit of knowledge through dialogue and inquiry. And Plato began to write, creating a series of dialogues, philosophical dramas, in which Socrates appeared as the main character, questioning and probing and examining. These dialogues preserved not just Socrates' method, but something of his personality, his irony and humor, his ability to puncture pretension, his relentless pursuit of truth. The early dialogues likely represent the historical Socrates fairly closely. Works like the Euthyphro, where Socrates questions a religious expert about the nature of piety, or the Apology, which presents Socrates' defense speech at his trial, or the Crito, where he explains why he will not escape from prison even when given the chance. But gradually, the dialogues became vehicles for Plato's own philosophy. Socrates, the character, began expressing views that went far beyond anything the historical Socrates likely believed. And Plato developed a comprehensive system that addressed not just ethics, but metaphysics, epistemology, politics, aesthetics, cosmology. At the heart of Plato's philosophy was the theory of forms, the idea that the physical world we perceive through our senses is not the most real world, that it is actually a kind of shadow or reflection of a higher realm of perfect eternal forms or ideas. Consider a circle drawn in the sand. It is never perfectly round. It has thickness and irregularity. It will be washed away by the tide. But the form of circle, the pure mathematical ideal, is eternal and perfect. It exists not in space and time, but in a transcendent realm accessible only to thought. And this was true not just of mathematical objects, but of everything. There was a form of beauty itself, of justice itself, of the good itself, and particular beautiful things, or just actions participated in or imitated these eternal forms. They were beautiful, or just to the extent that they resembled the perfect, unchanging archetypes. This solved the problem posed by Heraclitus and Parmenides. The physical world could change and flux just as Heraclitus said, but the forms were eternal and unchanging, just as Parmenides insisted. And true knowledge was not of the changing physical world, but of the unchanging forms. Plato illustrated this with his famous allegory of the cave. Imagine prisoners chained in a cave from childhood, facing a wall. Behind them a fire burns, and between the fire and the prisoners, people carry objects that cast shadows on the wall. The prisoners see only these shadows and take them for reality. But if a prisoner were freed and turned around, he would see the fire and the objects themselves and realize the shadows were mere reflections. And if he were dragged out of the cave into the sunlight, he would at first be blinded, but gradually his eyes would adjust, and he would see the real world, trees and mountains, and finally the sun itself, the source of all light and life. This, Plato said, was the journey of the philosopher, from the shadows of opinion and sense perception, up through mathematics and dialectic, to direct apprehension of the forms, and ultimately to knowledge of the form of the good, which illuminated all other knowledge just as the sun illuminated the physical world. Education then was not putting knowledge into empty minds, but turning the soul around, redirecting it from the shadows toward reality. And those who made this journey, the philosophers, were the only ones fit to rule, because only they understood what was truly good, what policies would create genuine justice and happiness rather than merely appearing to do so. In the Republic, Plato's longest and most influential dialogue, he designed an ideal city ruled by philosopher kings, where children were raised communally, where private property was abolished for the ruling class, where poets were banished for telling lies about the gods, a utopia that many readers find simultaneously inspiring and totalitarian. But Plato was not just theorizing. He tried 3 times to put his ideas into practice in Syracuse, a Greek city in Sicily, attempting to educate the young tyrant Dionysius the Younger, to turn him into a philosopher king, and 3 times it ended in failure and danger, Plato barely escaping with his life. Still, back in Athens, the academy flourished. Students came from across the Greek world, and among them, arriving at age 17 or 18, was a young man from Stagira in northern Greece, the son of a physician, brilliant and ambitious and destined to become even more influential than his teacher. His name was Aristotle, and he would study at the academy for 20 years until Plato's death, absorbing everything, questioning everything, and eventually developing a philosophy that departed from Plato's in fundamental ways, bringing philosophy down from the transcendent realm of forms and back to the physical world of nature and change. Aristotle was born in 384 before the Common Era in Stagira, a small town on the northern coast of the Aegean, far from the cultural center of Athens. His father Nicomachus was court physician to the king of Macedon, and this connection would shape Aristotle's life in unexpected ways. When he arrived at Plato's academy as a teenager, Aristotle was brilliant but also stubborn, willing to challenge his teacher. Plato supposedly called him the foal because, like a young horse, he was always kicking against the very one who nourished him. But this intellectual independence was precisely what would make Aristotle great. For 20 years he studied and taught at the academy, absorbing Plato's philosophy while developing doubts about it. And when Plato died in 347 before the Common Era, Aristotle left Athens, perhaps disappointed at not being chosen to lead the academy, perhaps simply ready to pursue his own path. He traveled to Asia Minor, to the island of Lesbos, studying marine biology, collecting specimens, examining the structure and behavior of sea creatures with meticulous care, and this empirical investigation of nature, this attention to particular facts and details, would become central to his philosophical method. Then came an extraordinary opportunity. Philip of Macedon, the king who was transforming his backward kingdom into a military superpower, invited Aristotle to tutor his 13-year-old son, Alexander. And for several years, Aristotle taught the boy who would become Alexander the Great, instructing him in Homer and Greek literature, in ethics and politics, though what influence this philosophical education had on Alexander's later career of conquest remains unclear. When Alexander ascended to the throne and began his campaigns, Aristotle returned to Athens, now in his 50s, and founded his own school, the Lyceum, named for the grove of Apollolykios, where it was located. Here he would walk along covered walkways while lecturing, and his followers became known as the Peripatetics, the walkers, at the Lyceum. Aristotle created something unprecedented. A research institution, he and his students collected information on an astonishing range of subjects. The constitutions of 158 Greek city-states, biological observations of hundreds of animal species, astronomical data, ethical case studies, literary analysis. They were attempting nothing less than to organize and understand all human knowledge. And Aristotle wrote, "Though what we have are not polished dialogues like Plato's, but lecture notes, treatises, working documents full of technical terminology and careful distinctions, texts that were studied and commented on for 2,000 years, that would dominate medieval philosophy and shape the development of science, where Plato had looked to an eternal realm of forms beyond the physical world." Aristotle insisted that the forms were in the things themselves, embedded in matter. There was no separate form of tree, but rather the form or essence of treeness existed in each individual tree, making it what it was, everything in nature. Aristotle argued had four causes: the material cause, what it was made of; the formal cause, what made it the kind of thing it was; the efficient cause, what brought it into being; and the final cause, what purpose or goal it served. And understanding anything meant grasping all four causes. This teleological view, this idea that natural things had inherent purposes, shaped his entire philosophy. An acorn had the potential to become an oak, and it actualized that potential by growing. Change was not random flux, but development toward natural ends, everything striving to fulfill its nature. For human beings, the key question was what our natural end or function was. And Aristotle's answer was eudaimonia, often translated as happiness, but really meaning flourishing or living well, the full realization of human potential. And this came through virtue, through excellent functioning according to reason, which was the distinctive human capacity. Virtue itself was not knowledge, as Socrates had claimed, but habit. We become virtuous by practicing virtuous actions, by finding the mean between extremes. Courage was the mean between cowardice and recklessness, generosity between stinginess and wastefulness. And this required practical wisdom, phronesis, the ability to perceive what action a situation called for. The highest human activity, Aristotle believed, was contemplation, theoretical study pursued for its own sake. This most resembled the activity of God, the unmoved mover who thought only about thinking, who set the cosmos in motion not through active intervention, but by being the object of love and desire toward which all things moved. In politics, Aristotle rejected Plato's ideal republic. He studied actual constitutions, analyzed what worked and what failed, concluded that the best realistic government was a mixed constitution balancing elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, with a large middle class providing stability, and he defended private property and the family against Plato's communalism. His influence was immediate and enduring. The Lyceum became a center of research and learning. But Aristotle's life ended in shadow. When Alexander died suddenly in 323 before the Common Era, anti-Macedonian sentiments swept Athens, and Aristotle, associated with the Macedonian court, was charged with impiety, the same charge that had killed Socrates. He fled to Chalcis, saying he would not allow Athens to sin twice against philosophy, and died there a year later, at 62, from a digestive illness. His will carefully provided for his household, freed his slaves, and arranged for his daughter's marriage, the practical concerns of a man who believed in living well in this world. After Aristotle, philosophy entered a new phase, the Hellenistic period, as Alexander's conquest spread Greek culture across the Mediterranean and into Asia, creating a cosmopolitan world where the old city-state loyalties seemed parochial, where individuals felt adrift in vast kingdoms, where the urgent question was not how to be a good citizen, but how to achieve personal tranquility in uncertain times. New schools emerged. Epicurus founded a garden school in Athens around 300 before the Common Era, teaching that pleasure was the highest good, though by pleasure he meant not wild indulgence, but the absence of pain and disturbance, ataraxia, tranquility, achieved through simple living, friendship, and the study of philosophy. The Epicureans believed the gods existed but did not intervene in human affairs, that the soul was material and dissolved at death, that there was therefore nothing to fear, no divine punishment, no afterlife, just the finite span of a life to be lived as pleasantly and peacefully as possible. And this required overcoming irrational fears and unnecessary desires. Meanwhile, Zeno of Citium, who had come to Athens as a merchant and stayed to study philosophy, founded the Stoic school around the same time, teaching in the Stoa Poikile, the painted colonnade from which his followers took their name. The Stoics believed in living according to nature, accepting whatever happened as the working of divine providence, a rational cosmic order that determined all events. Human freedom consisted not in controlling external circumstances, which was impossible, but in controlling one's own judgments and responses. Virtue alone was sufficient for happiness. The Stoics insisted everything else, health, wealth, reputation, family, were merely preferred indifference, nice to have, but ultimately irrelevant to true well-being. What mattered was maintaining proper judgment, not being disturbed by misfortune, accepting one's fate with equanimity. This philosophy would prove enormously influential, spreading throughout the Roman world, adopted by slaves like Epictetus and emperors like Marcus Aurelius, providing consolation and strength through times of persecution and chaos, teaching that inner freedom was inviolable even when outer freedom was lost. A third Hellenistic school, the Skeptics, took uncertainty itself as their theme, arguing that for every argument there was an equally strong counter-argument, that we should suspend judgment on all matters, achieving ataraxia through the recognition that nothing could be known for certain. They were descendants of Socrates in a way, taking his profession of ignorance to its logical extreme. These Hellenistic philosophies were less systematic than Plato and Aristotle, more focused on practical ethics than metaphysics. They offered not grand theories of reality, but recipes for living, techniques for achieving peace of mind, and they attracted followers across the Mediterranean world, adapting to different cultures, blending with local traditions. Greek philosophy also encountered other traditions. In Alexandria, the great library and museum became centers of learning where Greek thought mixed with Egyptian and Jewish ideas. Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher in the 1st century of the Common Era, tried to reconcile Plato with Scripture, reading the Hebrew Bible allegorically, finding Greek metaphysics in the book of Genesis, and as Rome absorbed the Greek world politically, it absorbed Greek philosophy intellectually. Educated Romans studied in Athens, read Plato and Aristotle, adopted Stoicism as particularly suited to their martial temperament. Cicero translated philosophical terms into Latin, making Greek thought accessible to a new audience. The final great ancient philosopher was Plotinus, who lived in the 3rd century of the Common Era, in a Roman Empire besieged by barbarians and racked by crisis. He developed Neoplatonism, a mystical interpretation of Plato that saw reality as emanating from the One, an ineffable source beyond being, flowing down through levels of decreasing unity and reality, nous or intellect, psyche or soul, and finally matter. The goal of philosophy for Plotinus was henosis, union with the One, achieved through contemplation and ascetic practice, turning away from the material world, ascending through the levels of reality until the soul merged with its source, and Plotinus claimed to have achieved this mystical union several times in his life. His student Porphyry collected his writings into the Enneads, and this late flowering of Greek philosophy would profoundly influence early Christian theology, providing concepts and vocabulary for articulating the relationship between God and creation, between the divine and human natures of Christ, between time and eternity. When the Emperor Justinian closed the philosophical schools of Athens in 529 of the Common Era, including Plato's Academy, which had survived for 900 years, it marked the end of ancient philosophy as a living tradition, but not the end of its influence, which had already spread far beyond Greece, into Christian Europe, into the Islamic world, into every culture that encountered the texts and questions these ancient thinkers had left behind. The voices have grown quieter now. The colonnades stand empty. The gardens where Epicurus taught are long overgrown, but the questions remain, hovering in the air like late afternoon light, questions about the nature of reality and the meaning of virtue, about how to live and what to value, about the relationship between knowledge and happiness, between reason and faith, between the individual and society. These ancient philosophers, with their simple robes and their endless conversations, created something that would never die, not a set of fixed doctrines, but a way of thinking, a commitment to following arguments wherever they led, to examining life rather than simply living it, to seeking wisdom even knowing it might forever elude our grasp. And so we find ourselves standing in this quiet space between antiquity and imagination, where the distant past feels strangely present, where questions asked more than 2 millennia ago still echo with unsettling relevance. What did these philosophers give us? These men who walked dusty paths and argued in marketplaces, who chose poverty and inquiry over comfort and certainty, who believed that thinking carefully about existence was the most important thing a human being could do. They gave us, first of all, the very idea that reality might be understood through reason, that beneath the chaos of appearances there might be order, patterns, principles discoverable through careful thought. This was not obvious. Most human cultures had explained the world through myth and tradition, through stories of gods and heroes, through received wisdom never meant to be questioned. But the Greeks dared to question, to propose natural explanations, to test ideas against logic and observation, and in doing so they created science, philosophy, critical thinking itself, the foundation of every intellectual discipline that followed. They gave us ethics as systematic inquiry. Before Socrates, people knew how to act. They followed customs and conventions. They honored the gods and obeyed their parents. But they did not ask why, did not examine the principles underlying right action, did not wonder whether conventional morality might be mistaken. Socrates made ethics philosophical, turned it into a subject requiring careful analysis, and his successors developed competing theories: virtue ethics focusing on character, Stoic ethics emphasizing acceptance, Epicurean ethics pursuing tranquility, each offering a different vision of human flourishing, each still debated today in slightly different vocabulary, but essentially unchanged questions. They gave us political philosophy, the attempt to think rationally about justice, about what made governments legitimate, about the relationship between individual freedom and collective welfare. Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Politics established frameworks that every subsequent political thinker would either build upon or react against. The idea that rulers should be wise rather than merely powerful, that laws should serve justice rather than simply express the will of the strong, that political arrangements could be evaluated and improved through reason. These were revolutionary concepts, and they planted seeds that would eventually grow into democracy, human rights, constitutional government. They gave us logic, the formal study of correct reasoning. Aristotle systematized the syllogism, analyzed fallacies, created tools for distinguishing valid from invalid arguments, and later Greek logicians like Chrysippus developed propositional logic, the foundation of mathematics and computer science, ways of thinking that would prove essential to every form of rigorous inquiry. They gave us wonder, that peculiar state of mind where curiosity overwhelms certainty, where questions become more valuable than answers. Aristotle said that philosophy begins in wonder, and the best Greek philosophers maintained that sense of astonishment throughout their lives, never lost the capacity to be amazed by existence, by the fact that there is something rather than nothing, that the cosmos is ordered rather than chaotic, that consciousness emerged from matter and can contemplate its own origins. This wonder was not mystical but rational, not passive but active. It demanded investigation, explanation, understanding, yet it also recognized limits, knew that some mysteries might prove impenetrable, that human reason, powerful as it was, might never grasp ultimate reality. And this combination of confidence and humility, of ambition and modesty, characterized the best Greek philosophy. They gave us models of philosophical lives, Socrates facing death with courage, Diogenes living in a barrel and mocking convention, Epicurus cultivating friendship in his garden, Epictetus maintaining dignity in slavery, Marcus Aurelius seeking wisdom on the battlefield. These were not just thinkers, but exemplars, showing that philosophy was not academic abstraction, but a way of being in the world. The philosophical life required sacrifice. It meant valuing truth over popularity, wisdom over wealth, integrity over success. It meant accepting that most people would not understand, that you might be mocked or persecuted, that you might die for your principles as Socrates did, yet it offered something invaluable in return: the examined life, the life lived consciously, with awareness and purpose, and perhaps most profoundly, they gave us ourselves, or at least a particular understanding of what it meant to be human. The Greek philosophers invented the concept of the autonomous, rational individual, the self-capable of questioning tradition, of making independent judgments, of taking responsibility for its own beliefs and actions. Before Greek philosophy, identity was primarily collective. You were a member of a tribe, a family, a city. Your role was defined by tradition and maintained through ritual. But Socrates insisted that each person must think for themselves, must examine their own lives, must take ownership of their souls. This emphasis on individual rationality and moral autonomy would become foundational to Western culture. For better and worse, it enabled scientific progress in human rights, but also alienation and rootlessness. It freed individuals from oppressive traditions, but also cut them off from sources of meaning and belonging. The Greek legacy is therefore complex, not simply a gift, but a challenge, an invitation to think, to question, to seek wisdom, but also a warning about the costs of such seeking, about how philosophical inquiry can destabilize certainties, can leave us uncertain and anxious, can reveal problems we cannot solve. Yet perhaps this uncertainty is itself valuable. Perhaps the questions matter more than the answers. Perhaps philosophy's greatest contribution is not any particular doctrine or system, but the practice itself, the ongoing conversation, the willingness to keep thinking, to keep examining, to never settle into dogmatic slumber. The light has grown softer now, that golden afternoon light deepening toward evening, the shadows stretching long across ancient stones. And in this gentle dimming there is something peaceful, something like acceptance. We cannot return to Athens in its glory, cannot sit at Socrates' feet or walk with Aristotle, cannot join the philosophical schools or debate in the agora. That world is gone, lost to time as completely as the sound of their voices, the texture of their actual daily lives. What remains are texts, fragments, commentaries upon commentaries, words preserved through centuries of copying and translation, sometimes distorted, sometimes clarified, always at a remove from the living thought that first produced them. And yet, when we read Plato's dialogues or Aristotle's treatises, when we encounter Socrates questioning, Epicurus counseling, Marcus Aurelius reflecting, something comes alive. Not the historical reality, perhaps, but something equally real. A meeting of minds across time, a conversation that death cannot end. The questions they asked are our questions still. What is justice? What is happiness? How should we live? What can we know? What is real? These are not ancient puzzles, but perennial human concerns, and their attempts at answers, however flawed or incomplete, still illuminate our own groping toward understanding. Philosophy continues in universities and coffee shops, in solitary thought and public debate, building on what the Greeks began, using their methods, refining their arguments, sometimes rejecting their conclusions, but always indebted to their example, to their audacious belief that human reason could make sense of existence. The stars are beginning to appear, one by one, in the deepening blue above, the same stars the Greeks saw, though they understood them differently, thought them fixed in crystalline spheres, divine and eternal. We know now they are distant suns, some already dead, their light still traveling toward us across impossible distances. But that difference in understanding does not diminish the wonder, does not make the stars less beautiful, and perhaps Greek philosophy is like that, its specific doctrines superseded, its cosmology outdated, its science primitive, yet its essential achievement untouched, the achievement of thinking, of questioning, of refusing to accept ignorance as fate. The air grows cool, the way it does as daylight fades, and there is something in this cooling, this gentle transition from light to darkness, that feels appropriate, like a natural conclusion, not an ending, but a passing, a giving way. The philosophers are gone, their voices silent, their footsteps no longer echo on marble, but what they made. This thing called philosophy, this practice of careful thinking, continues, changes, adapts, remains always vital, always necessary. And in some sense they are not gone. Not entirely, for whenever someone stops to think clearly about existence, to question assumptions, to examine life rather than simply living it, Socrates is there, Plato is there, Aristotle is there, all of them present in the act of philosophical inquiry itself. The last light lingers on the hilltops, reluctant to go, painting everything in shades of amber and rose. And then softly, gradually, it fades, leaving the world to darkness and to stars, to the quiet that comes after speaking, to the peace that follows questions, when we accept that some answers must wait, perhaps forever. Perhaps that too is wisdom, knowing when to rest, when to let go, when to simply be here, now, in this moment of fading light, this threshold between day and night, between knowing and unknowing, between the voice and the silence that follows.